You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. Fire Ecology is a journal that's published by Springer Nature, and it is overseen in its entirety by the Association for Fire Ecologists. Today, we're going to talk about a very interesting paper, one that I was very interested in. The name of the paper is Fire, Land Use, and the Long-Term Dynamics of Pitch Pine Woodland in Coastal Maine, USA. And today, we have two great people to talk about this. First, we have Andrew Barton. Andrew, would you want to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from?
I'm Andrew Barton. I'm at the University of Maine at Farmington, and most of my research is in the Southwest on fire ecology and climate change, but I do research in Maine as well, including this project.
And we're also lucky to have Dan Grenier. Dan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name's Dan Grenier, and I currently work for the Maine Bureau of Parks and Lands and their planning and acquisition team. But I'm coming off a 21-year career with the Nature Conservancy in Maine, working as a land manager.
Wonderful. Thank you both for coming and sharing this paper. It's an incredibly important paper. It's a paper about a specific ecosystem that is rarely studied. So I'm glad you guys could talk about it. Andrew, most of our listeners know that my very first question is always tell us about the paper.
Yes. Well, we need to start with the species, which is pitch pine. Pitch pine is a tree species in the eastern U.S. It is considered pyrophilic, meaning it really likes fire. It has many adaptations to fire. It relies on disturbances like fire to prevent its successional replacement by more mesophytic species like red oak and maple, etc. It reaches around its northern range limits in Maine, which is a state that doesn't really have a whole lot of fire, much less fire prone than the rest of the US. So just in that is like an interesting question. What is pitch pine doing here? Where does it occur and how can it occur here? And people also care a lot about pitch pine woodlands because they support a suite of rare species. And these ecosystems are really uncommon. They occur pretty much only on exposed, very dry sites, which are a little bit unusual in Maine, but they also occur in the canopy and some moisture sites, perhaps as remnants from past disturbance. Our paper tries to understand the relationships among fire and land use over the last couple of centuries and pitch pine. In fact, we tried to take a very long view over the last 9,000 years, and we examined the relationships among those things, like how has fire affected pitch pine abundance? How has land use in recent centuries affected pitch pine abundance in this environment in mid-coast Maine? So we look at it across this moisture gradient all the way from these very exposed, very dry sites all the way down to much moister sites where it pretty much only occurs in the canopy now. Really, one of our main motivations is to determine into the future whether maintenance of pitch pine will require active management, like prescribed fire, for example, to reduce competing vegetation and allow pitch pine to continue to establish and maintain populations, and also maintain all of this suite of rare species that are associated with it. So that's pretty much the project in capsule.
Yeah, I can admit, when I first read this paper, Andrew, I immediately got in my truck. I have a small camp in Maine on a lake, and I got in my truck and I drove to this property. And it's a beautiful ecosystem, and it's a wonderful piece of property, and it's a great stand that you studied. Dan, can you tell us about this particular study area?
Yeah, I can a little bit. This is a 1,900-acre piece of property that was given to the Nature Conservancy by an anonymous donor in 2006, and it includes more than 4 miles of coastline that surround the basin, which is a saltwater inlet on the New Meadows River, and there's about 4 miles of this coastline. It's used locally for clamming, fishing, hiking, recreational sort of stuff. And within the site, there also is this large, extensive stand of rare pitch pine woodland. I'm a former student of Drew's. He was my advisor back in the day. And at that time that TNC acquired this property, I was responsible for managing the site with my supervisor at the time. Her name was Nancy Sfera. And we reached out to Drew to share this special site to see if there's some information he might be able to help us with, some unique way to look at the site to better understand it and to help us better manage and steward it. The pitch pine woodlands, again, is sort of in the middle of the site. There's these long, extensive ridges that kind of run a northeast, southwest orientation, and they're a great example here, one of the better examples of this natural community in Maine. So again, we wanted to be sure that we were managing this unique resource in the best way possible. And that's sort of how the project started from my place.
Yeah, people, when they think about Maine, the first thing that doesn't come to their mind is the fact that it's a fire ecosystem. I remember reading a paper where Maine had a fire return interval of 1,600 years. So thinking that this fire in pitch pine is probably alien to a lot of Mainers. So, Andrew, on that topic, what were your methods and what did you find in this study?
I think any study you do, you look back and you think, oh, I should have done this differently. And there certainly are a few things I feel like, oh, if I could do it again, I would do this differently. But I think the strength of it was that we used a lot of different methods. We used multiple lines of evidence to try to reconstruct this long-term changes in abundance of pitch pine and the relationship between that and fire and Euro-American settlement, disturbance, land clearing, etc. So we use multiple methods, which you kind of have to do in a study like this because everything is a bit correlative. It's hard to carry out experiments, etc. I think that was the strength. So there are multiple parts to it. One part is just to figure out what is the abundance in different places across this moisture gradient. As Dan described, there are these ridges that run parallel, and then they drop down very short distance down to very moist places and even fens and boggy kind of places. So I've always worked along environmental gradients, and this was very compelling because these environmental gradients were steep but really short. So it was easy to do this kind of work. So we went out, we looked at where are they establishing seedlings in comparison to where the adults are and the environment. We measured all kinds of things about the environment, including nutrient availabilities, soil depth, moisture stress, etc. That was one part of the study. We took cores to establish age structures to get an idea of when this forest began regenerating after pasture abandonment. We were lucky enough to find some fire scars on some pitch pines, and Dan went out and collected those sections, sanded them, and we dated those as well as the cores to look at, is there any evidence actually of 20th century fire in these places, and scanned the literature and newspapers to find evidence of fires as well. And then we had the whole paleoecology part of this work as well. So we took a couple of cores in some small hollows right in the middle of our study area, and we were able to actually look over the last 9,000 years at charcoal levels, indicating large pieces of charcoal, so indicating local fires, as well as pollen influx of different species. Not just pitch pine, but other species as well over this 9,000 year period. So we put all these methods together to really put together a story. And it kind of does read like a story. It is one of those papers that is very narrative in that way. So to look at, has pitch pine actually been there for a long time? And how has its abundance changed over time? And how does that relate to the incidence of fire? And how did it change with Euro-American settlement and land clearing, etc.? And how is it changing today with pasture abandonment? And what does it look like will be the story in the future as well, and what does that tell us about management?
It's incredibly important how the results fit into how you're going to manage that or how the Nature Conservancy will manage it in the future. So how do you think, is it possible that you could actually do some prescribed burning in this pitch pine? How would Nature Conservancy manage this piece of property in the future?
I'll say one thing, then I'm going to turn it over to Dan, because Dan will be able to answer that question a lot better than I can. I think that the results make a pretty clear fork in the road, if you will. And it depends on what values do we want to manage for. If we want to manage for pre-Euro-American settlement conditions, we probably leave it alone. If instead we want to maintain a large area of this pitch pine woodland, ridgetop pitch pine woodlands, then we'd go in and reduce vegetation with active management. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan about the practicality of thinning or burning, et cetera, in those sites, because he knows a lot more than I do about that.
I guess what I would say there is the Nature Conservancy has the expertise to manage either side of that fork. They have the know-how and the team to be able to pull off prescribed fire activity. There surely are challenges in mid-coast Maine with population and managing people's sort of concerns and smoke and those sorts of things, but they have a team to be able to manage that things properly. And as Drew mentioned, they could also go the other way and manage this for historic conditions. As Drew mentioned, I think both paths are possible, and I'm not sure if the Nature Conservancy process the results of this paper yet, but it's certainly possible.
I think that's great. Nature Conservancy has reached out and would like me to give a talk on this. I think help them process it some. It's hard to get a lot of people to, read over a paper in detail when they're so busy as it is. So I'm hoping to visit there sometime, perhaps next fall, and talk more about this.
That's great. So I want to thank you both for taking the time out to tell us about this interesting paper today. Andrew, is there any other co-authors or funding agencies you wish to recognize?
Well, the Nature Conservancy was really generous all the way through with funding and practical support. And it was great working with them. It's intrinsically a really interesting question to me. But Dan and I had actually worked on a previous project on Nature Conservancy land. So I already had worked with them some. And I enjoyed that so much that the prospect of doing another project with TNC in Maine was, again, really compelling. And it was a lot of fun to do this project.
Great. With that, if people are interested in this study, you know what? You can download the paper and read it, or you can read it on the website for free. Andrew has already paid the freight for you to read this paper, and you can find out exactly what he found and exactly how the data can be used. It's a really interesting paper, and I suggest you download it. So until next time, thank you from the Association of Fire Ecology, and join us for another Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FIREECOLOGY.org.